Hey guys, this is Chris Monk at Highline Guitars, and you're watching another episode from the Luthier's Workbench. In this episode, I'm going to cover part 5 of my Apollyon 6-string Floyd Rose guitar build. Now in part 4, I talked about the process that I follow when I level sand the finish using 800 grit sandpaper. And in this episode, I'm going to take it to the next step, and I'm going to begin polish sanding by moving through finer grits until I'm ready to buff it. Then we're going to head over to the buffing machine and bring up a high gloss mirror-like shine on this guitar body. So let's get started. Okay, I'm finished with the 800 grit level sanding, and now I'm ready to move on to the polishing phase. I'm going to do that by using the Apollyon sanding pads, and I'm going to start with 1000 grit, and it's pretty simple, straightforward. I'm just going to sand in roughly the same direction over the entire surface of the guitar, and what I'm trying to do is replace the 800 grit sanding scratches from the leveling with 1000 grit sanding scratches. And once that's done, I'll move on to 2000 grit and I'll finish it. Now these sanding pads will start to load up with residue from sanding. To clean it out, all you need to do is just suck it out with a shop vac. Now the nice thing about the Apollyon pads is they start out sanding fairly aggressively, but as you start to use them, they kind of mellow out a little bit, and it's like they improve as you use them. So even though technically I am sanding the surface, I really like to think of it as polishing. And you can start to see, especially if you look at it at a low angle, you can start to see the reflections as it gets smoother. So I'll just continue sanding all the entire surface of the body, the top, the sides, the back, and then when I'm finished, I'll repeat that process with the 2000 grit, and then I'll be ready to buff. One thing I also need to mention is when I level sanded with the 800 grit paper, I stayed away from these edges all the way around, so you can see that the surface of the finish is that dull kind of flat matte sheen, but then right up close to the edge it's still shiny. That's because I didn't sand there. I don't like to sand with 800 grit paper up over the edges because of the potential for sand through, and it really isn't necessary because the edges are pretty smooth as it is. However, I am going to hit it with a light shot of the 1000 grit Apollyon, and that will smooth out any potential rough spots without the chance of sanding through. So I'll just lightly touch those as I'm continuing to polish the back of the guitar, but you can see how that shine goes away as soon as you hit it with that Apollyon. So you know once that shine has gone away that you're finished and can move on to the next section. You don't want to linger over those edges for too long. To buff up the finish on my guitars to a mirror gloss shine, I use a homemade buffing machine, and I've talked about this machine before in previous videos, so I'm not going to get back into that again. I'll try and put a link in the description below so that you can go back and look at how I built this thing. But I've got 12-inch wheels on both sides, although they started out as 12 inches. These have gotten pretty heavily used, and they're now down to about 9 inches, so I'm getting ready to replace these, but they're still working fine for now, so I'm not too worried about it. But on this side I use Menzerna Brown Coarse Polishing Compound, and that's all that's left of a stick that started out about this size. So this has lasted a long time. These are a great investment. They're like 25 to 30 bucks for a stick, and they'll last you for years. On this side, this is the fine, very fine buffing wheel, and I use tan Menzerna Fine polishing compound. So I'll start on this side and I'll bring up the initial polish. Once that's done, I'll let the guitar sit for about 30 minutes to cure, because when you buff with these, it's spinning about 900 RPM. It will generate quite a bit of heat, and it will heat up that clear coat, which softens it. So if you, after you're done buffing, if you grab a rag and try to wipe it down, there's a good chance you'll put some scratches into the surface because it's softened by the heat. So you want to let it cool down first, like I said, for 30 minutes at least, and then go back, wipe off all the residue that's left over from buffing with this wheel, and then move on to the very fine wheel and repeat that process. And this will bring up the highest level of shine. And again, once you're done with that, you'll hang it up, let it cool, then you'll wipe it down with a soft cloth to remove that fine buffing residue. So when you buff, I recommend you wear some kind of eye or facial protection. And it's a good idea to also wear a respirator, because these things do put off quite a bit of dust in the air, and you don't want to be breathing that in. So you can kind of see how we're starting to get a shine going on this. This is just the coarse cutting compound, so it's not going to bring up a mirror shine yet. But a couple of things. When you're buffing, you know, this machine is turning in this direction, which is the proper direction for a buffing wheel to turn. That way you can buff down here, and if for some reason something were to catch, it's going to throw it down and not throw it back up at you. That's just, you know, common buffing safety 101. The other thing is as you're buffing, you can experiment with how long you hold the body in one spot or how quickly you move it. One thing you want to be careful of is buffing over these edges because you're generating a lot of heat, and when that heat is focused on a sharp edge like this, it'll just melt the finish right off. So you have to be pretty careful about that. So I'm always keeping my work moving as I'm buffing over these edges, but you can vary the pressure and try different amounts of pressure to see what's going to give you the best polish. And one thing I do recommend if you ever build a buffing machine like this is I recommend that you test on some scrap pieces of wood with finish to find out what the optimum speed and the optimum amount of pressure is. You just never know until you get into doing it. And the last thing you want to do is test on a guitar without really knowing what's going to happen, because you could destroy the finish. Okay, so this is how my clear coat finish looks after it's been level sanded, polished, and then buffed out. And as you can see, it's pretty shiny and pretty reflective. However, it's not completely finished yet. There's still one more step that I need to do before I can call it done. If you look closely at the reflected light, you can see very fine scratches. And what I need to do is take those out. And I'll do that by wiping the surface of the guitar down with a swirl remover. However, I'm not going to do that quite yet. I would rather do most of the remaining assembly, install the neck, the pickups, the bridge, the electronics. I'll do everything except install the strings, and then I'll wipe down the whole guitar body with the swirl remover, make it look really nice. Then I'll do the last little bit of assembly, setup, and all that good stuff. So it's getting close.